Hello. I have a question for you today. We are Christians and we all read the Bible, or at least we say we do, on a regular basis. So, my question to you today is if someone approached you on the street and asked you the question, can you take the Bible that you read and show me from that Bible why you believe what you believe, what would your answer be to that person? I'm sure that all of our answers would be, why, of course, I can take this Bible and show you why I believe what I believe. But before you answer that so quickly, here is a specific question that is asked of us all the time that I have never heard anyone give a proper response to this question. And the question is this: since you use musical instruments in worship to the Lord, then I want you to show me from the New Testament where these musical instruments are found. And if you looked in the entire New Testament, ironically, you would not find one single musical instrument spoken of in the New Testament. So at that point, what would your answer be? You would most definitely have to answer, well, musical instruments are in the Old Testament and they're in the book of Revelation, but to be quite honest with you, I can't find one musical instrument in the New Testament being talked about. Now, those that are of the opposite view, in other words, those that command the abstinence of musical instruments in worshiping the Lord, they have scripture in the New Testament that they use to show or prove that musical instruments are prohibited in worshiping the Lord. Now, what I want to do today is not go over all the scriptures that they use. It's found in Ephesians, Colossians, and James. But I want to use one of the most popular, if you would, scriptures that is used to for their side proving that musical instruments are prohibited from worship today. We'll talk about that a little bit. So I want to read Ephesians 5:19, and then I want to talk about their argument and where they come from. Actually, they have two different arguments. One is from the Bible itself, and the other one is from history, an historical argument. But Ephesians 5:19, by the way, this is the most popular verse that is put forward in opposition to musical instruments today. And it goes like this: speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Now, when you hear those that prohibit musical instruments, we'll call them exclusion, because their idea is that musical instruments are excluded from worship in the New Testament church. So I will call them exclusion today. Their argument comes from the word singing here that's found in verse 19. Notice it says singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Now, when you hear exclusion arguing against musical instruments, they will emphasize the word singing, and they will conclude that the word singing demands the definition of a cappella only. In other words, no musical instruments, vocal only, without musical instruments. However, there are numerous words that we find in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. First of all, you have the word speaking, which means to utter a voice or emit a sound, and it is a transliterated word. That means it was brought from the Old Testament to the New Testament without the definition changing. So whatever speaking means in the New Testament, it meant that also in the Old Testament. That's important to remember. Speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Now, it's very important that we understand that we are to speak to ourselves. Whatever we're doing, there are 3 different ways that Ephesians 5:19 says that we can do it. And here they are: psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Now, let's look at the definition of these words as they're found in Strong's Concordance, which is, by the way, the most popular Bible definition concordance there is out there today. So these definitions come from Strong's Concordance, and you can look these up for yourself. First of all, the word psalms here, which is found here and in Colossians and in James, the word psalms. In James it says, "Is any merry among you? Let him sing psalms." But this word is also a transliterated word. That means whatever psalms meant in the Old Testament, it also means in the New Testament. Now, those that argue in favor of prohibiting musical instruments today, they will argue that the definition for the word psalms changed over time. And that is how they make the argument that, well, Psalms today doesn't mean what Psalms meant when the book of Ephesians was actually written, or to the earliest Christians that existed in the church that became visible on the day of Pentecost. So we have the definition for Psalms, which is a transliterated word. And if you look this definition up in Strong's, it is defined as a striking, twanging of striking the chords of a musical instrument. So this word psalms, found in the New Testament, has the idea of playing a musical instrument, just as it has that idea in the Old Testament. The definition and meaning stays the same in the New Testament. Second of all, we have the word hymns here, and that is also a transliterated word, and it actually means a song in tithe praise of God's heroes and conquerors. So it is actually a song. It doesn't say anything about being accompanied by a musical instrument, but it also does not say that it is accompanied only by the chorus. Remember, it doesn't define that a hymn is sung with an instrument or with a voice only. It doesn't make that distinction about hymns. Lastly, we have spiritual songs, and it actually means exactly what it says: a spiritual song or a spirit-filled song. Now let's read farther in our verse here, Ephesians 5:19. By the way, this is the same verse that exclusionists use to make the argument against musical instruments in the church. My argument today in favor of musical instruments will come from the same scripture. Now we continue reading, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. All these words are included in Ephesians 5:19, and a large part of the time when we hear the opposite argument, they emphasize, as I said before, the word singing here, and they define it as singing vocally only with the voice. However, let's see what the actual definition of the word singing here in Ephesians 5:19 is. As I said before, I looked this definition up in Strong's Concordance, and if you look up the definition of singing in Strong's Concordance, it is defined as simply to sing. It is not defined as to sing only with the vocal or only with the voice, and it is also not defined as to sing only with a musical instrument. In other words, singing is the same as song. Here in this verse, it does not distinguish between what you are to sing with, the voice or the musical instrument. It simply says to sing. Now, based upon the definition of these words, this verse 19 cannot limit worshiping the Lord only to the voice. Because when we look at the actual definition of our words, these different categories of singing, which are songs, spiritual songs, they allow for musical instruments. They do not ever prohibit using musical instruments. They do not prohibit using the voice. Actually, it leaves the choice up to the one that is singing. The important thing to get from Ephesians 5:19 is actually the last phrase in the verse. Making melody in your heart to the Lord. In other words, it must originate from the heart, whether it's voice and a cappella only, or whether it's the voice accompanied with the instrument. It must originate from the heart, or it is not true worship anyway. The word melody here is a verb, and it means to touch or strike the chord, to twang the strings of a musical instrument so that they gently vibrate. That is the definition of the word melody. It is actually a verb, and it's the verb psallo, P-S-A-L-L-O. And as I said before, the main teaching from Ephesians 5:19 is to make sure that our worship originates from the heart, as it says here, in your heart to the Lord. Now, what about the historical argument that exclusion makes? Exclusion makes the argument that if you look at the first 100 to 300 years of the early church, you will find that the church did not use musical instruments of worship. Let's apply an illustration from our time. Now, I have done an in-depth study about Christians and wine in the New Testament, and you can look at that study on YouTube at my channel, Larry Kinsler, if you want to look at that. And when I did an in-depth study on Christians and wine, I found out that the Bible never prohibits Christians partaking of wine, but the Bible always condemns drunkenness to wine and addiction to wine. Now, let's say that 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 years have passed, and let's say a Christian in the future is looking back to church history, and he's looking back from the period of the 1920s up until the 2020s, a 100-year period of time. If they looked in that historical time period, I can assure you that you will find virtually no Christians partaking of wine during that historical time period. Now, my question is, did the Christians during the time period of the 1920s to the 2020s not partake of wine because the Bible commanded them not to? Absolutely not. The reason that Christians today do not partake of wine is because of something that was called the prohibition that started in the 1920s. In other words, what I'm saying is, it is so taboo today for a Christian to partake of wine publicly that no Christian does that today. And by the way, if you are a Christian that partakes of wine, which the Bible does allow, if you publicly let that be made known today, there is a 100% chance that you are going to offend a weaker brother in the faith. That is how taboo the drinking of wine or the partaking of wine is to the Christian believer today. In the period from the 1920s to the 2020s, if you were a Christian 500 years from now and you looked back to our history, you would find the absence of the drinking of wine in the everyday lives of Christian believers. And, by the way, you would find the absence of wine in the Christian communion services. Now, the reason that wine was not there during that historical period was not because the Bible prohibited it. It was because Christians chose, for whatever reasons, to not partake of the wine. Now, I'm making this argument because if you look back at church history, you will find that the reason the early church did not use musical instruments in their worship was not because that God directly commanded them not to use musical instruments. So that's not the reason that they didn't use them. What you will find is that early Christianity came from the Jewish religion. Remember, the first Christians were Jewish. They worshipped in the synagogues, and they brought some traditions with them. Read Acts chapter 21. One of the traditions that they brought from the synagogue was that in a Jewish synagogue worship service, there was no musical instruments involved. So it is simply a matter of tradition. And I will say this also, that a large majority of the early population, the citizenry back then, you didn't have to be a Christian, they deemed that musical instruments had a certain bad name that was associated with it. So if you look back at early church history, you will find the reasons that early Christians did not employ musical instruments of worship in their services was not because of a direct command from God not to do so, and you will not find that in the New Testament either, by the way. You'll definitely not find it in Ephesians 5:19. When we look closely at this verse here, we will find the definitions of these words allow for either vocal or musical instruments or both. It is simply a matter of choice. So when someone approaches you and asks you or demands you to give a reason for the belief that you have, if you use musical instruments in worship, then hopefully this teaching here will help you to be able to answer that charge. Once again, let's read our verse. Ephesians 5:19. By the way, this is the same scripture that Exclusion uses in their arguments against musical instruments in the worship service today. Speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. So let's look at our definitions once again. We are told here in this verse that there are three different types of songs that we can use. They are psalms, which are twanging the chords of the musical instrument, transliterated from the Old Testament. Whatever it meant in the Old Testament, it means in the New Testament. Hymns, which meant a song and tithe praise of God's heroes or conquerors, and spiritual songs, which would be a spirit-filled song. By the way, in 1 Corinthians 14:15, the Bible says, I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. If I were going to be making a requirement for the proper type of singing in the New Testament church, I would refer to this verse here in 1 Corinthians 14:15. Make sure that your singing is spiritual, and make sure that your singing goes along with what the Bible teaches, that it's in fact biblical. So with that said, let's look at the last phrase of our verse again. Singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. The important thing to remember in Ephesians 5:19 is that worship, true worship, must originate from the heart. If it originates from the heart, whether it's vocal only or whether it's vocal accompanied with musical instruments, it will be satisfying to the Lord. It will be the proper type of worship if it originates from the heart. Everything must originate from the heart, whether it's in our everyday lives, our worship. By the way, Ephesians 5:19, if you look at the entire context of Scripture, are things that Christians are to do in their everyday lives, not just when we're gathered together on the Lord's Day. Now, what's interesting is, even within Exclusion's crowd, there are some that teach you can only properly worship the Lord when you're gathered together. Their authorized worship would be limited to congregational as well as a cappella, while other ones teach that you can in fact worship the Lord a cappella if you are isolated as an individual. You're allowed to do that individually. It's interesting that they have that debate within their own groups about the authority or the proper type of worship. So I hope this has helped you today. I've thought about this for a long time, so I hope this has been of help to you also. Thank you.